There's an age-old question that most players ask themselves when they sit down and play a game of Magic is, am I the beatdown deck or am I supposed to be the control deck in the matchup? And hopefully when you sit down and play, if you play at larger tournaments or even just smaller ones, it's a thing that you keep in the back of your mind. And knowing your role in every match and every matchup that you sit down and play in, it's super important, can be the difference between winning and losing. So I'll kind of explain what I mean by that and knowing your role before I get into these main points that I felt were super important to outline and going deeper into this topic. So knowing your role in the matchup really is just knowing what deck am I playing and who I'm playing against. Do you want to be more aggressive or do you want to be controlling? And something that kind of a thing that can change throughout game or in between games and even in between matches. So for example, like mono red, you're obviously always the aggressor, and when you're playing a control deck, you're always you're stopping whatever your opponent's doing. So when I talk about aggro and control decks, I mean it in those two just broad terms, like when you play against Jeskai control or blue-white control, things like that, or you're playing mono red or mono green and things like that. Those are obviously aggro decks. They're one is trying to win the game either as fast as possible or trying to find the easiest route to victory to win the game as fast as possible. And the other one is trying to make sure that when they're trying to win the game, there's the least path of resistance to win the game while also not losing the game. So those are kind of like the two roles that I'll bring up. And just to remember, just for the sake of this video, that aggro doesn't always necessarily mean that you're playing mono red or mono green, and that control necessarily means that you're playing a deck with counter spells or playing Jeskai control and things like that. It's more of what you're doing during the match and what you're doing in those games that dictate what kind of role you're taking in the game. So one of the things to keep in mind when you sit down and start playing the match is, are you on the play or on the draw? And while it seems like, well, yeah, you're the aggro deck, you want to be on the play, and when you're the control deck, you want to be on the play just so you can start tempoing and playing your things, so you can easily kind of like put the game away, have your opponent like have to play into your things first rather than you having to react more and have more specific answers. When you're on the draw, you can have a wider range of answers when you're on the play against those other matchups. So really being on the play or draw, while obviously you want to be on the play, if you're in the unfortunate spot where you have to be in the draw, that's where you have to decide, like, okay, am I going to have to be the aggressor? Am I going to have to play a more controlling style and try to limit the outs my opponent has, or just hope that I can be fast enough to beat whatever outs they could possibly have? So really recognizing what you want to be doing, what your deck is supposed to do, and the things that you have to be doing when you're on the play or when you're on the draw is super important, no matter what format or whatever deck you're playing. It's just super important to know, play or draw, what am I supposed to be doing? So number two, are you the aggro deck or control deck? And I kind of already went over it. If your deck is trying to just win the game as fast as possible, then that's what you kind of have to realize, is that you have to win the game as fast as possible. So you have to remember look at your hand, really see, like, is this going to help me execute the game plan that I want to execute? And same with the control decks, is like, is this going to keep me alive long enough so I can eventually attempt to win the game? So going deeper into it even, what about those two aggro decks? It's always never aggro versus a control deck. It's always a wide variety thing. It could be anything. So that's another thing where you want to try to think of, like, am I the aggro deck or the control deck? And it's a role that constantly changes whenever you're playing. So, and it's kind of something I'll explain in this other point when you identify yourself as the control player in a certain matchup. So when you're playing against two aggro decks, two mono red decks, so obviously both of you want to be aggressive. You want to just kill your opponent, because the best way to make sure you win the game is if their life total is 0 before they can really do anything to you, is deciding, am I going to be the person that pushes the initiative? Am I going to be the person that's just like, all right, have your spells deal with my things, and my spells are just going to go to your face? Or are you going to be on the other side of the table where you're going to play your spells to deal with whatever their threats are and try to eventually then become the aggressor? Or are you just going to kind of sit back and react to what they're doing and make them use their resources inefficiently while you're trying to use yours efficiently? And that's where I told you in the beginning to keep the idea of aggro and control deck loose, because it does change depending on the matchup, and there'll be a lot of times where you find yourself playing an aggressive deck and wanting to be a control deck, or playing the control deck and just really aggressively trying to find ways to win the game, and trying to win the game before your opponent can really do anything. And looking at them in the traditional sense is just something that you can't do, especially now in Standard and Modern. It's really just, no matter what deck you're playing, you almost have to have some kind of side that can turn into a control deck, and another side where you can just kind of step on the gas and punch it to the finish line. So going even deeper into this rabbit hole, control players, in quotes, because again, you're not necessarily playing Hallowed Fountains or Steam Vents in your deck, and you're automatically the control deck. When you're the control player in the matchup, when should you turn the corner? And turning the corner is, when should you start being aggressive? When do you stop reacting and stop like having the answers for what your opponent's doing, and then you decide yourself, I'm going to start doing things, I'm going to make them have the answers for it. And really, you should look at turning the corner. An obvious way is, your opponent doesn't have any cards in hand, they don't really have a board, and they're just top decking at that point. And you can find a way to apply pressure to them and force them to like have very specific things now, rather than just having broad general things to play, and continue to make them play in an aggressive style. You want to put them on the back foot, because putting them on the back foot forces them to have to change game plans mid-game, and you only ever really want to have it happen to you once, or really do it once. Once you shift from being the control player to the aggro player, you want to continue to be the aggro player until the opponent's dead. And when you're the aggro player, you really don't want to even shift to being the control player, because going from aggressive to controlling is very hard, while going from controlling to aggressive is a lot easier, and a lot easier of a jump for whoever assumes that role, or whoever has that role. So that's kind of why it's important to, when you're the control player, identify those obvious situations when you should just be aggressive and go for it, and also realize maybe how many cards your opponents went through, what cards are you worried about seeing. If you've seen already 2 or 3 copies of a card and you're worried about them having a 4th, there's probably a pretty good chance that they don't have the 4th one, and you could start just playing around that card and making that card their specific out to that situation, but also making sure that that card just doesn't completely shift the tides again and put you on the back foot after trying to put them in a corner and really push them to have those very specific things. And very lastly, being the aggro player, or assuming the aggro role in a match, keep being aggressive. Now, that doesn't mean that you just need to, when you're the mono red player, just keep throwing burn spells at their face while they have creatures in play, and hoping that you could just eventually burn them out. Or being the mono white deck and making really bad and really questionable attacks into blocks that just blow you out. Being aggressive, you really want to understand that you're there for the short term, and you want the game to obviously not go any longer, because the more turns your opponent has obviously means the more chance that they could draw something that could beat you or stop you from being aggressive and put you on the back foot, which again we just talked about you really don't want to happen to you. You have to play your cards in a way that makes it punishing for your opponent, even when they have the answers. So while it's tempting to play a lava runner on turn 1, and then your opponent plays a 2/2 on turn 2 or whatever, say you're on the draw, they play a 2/2, that obviously I want this Wizard's Lightning to go to my opponent's face. It's 3 damage. This is 3 damage that go to my opponent's face. And maybe, depending on what your hand is, and that's something we'll get into with like mulliganing and deck construction and things like that, is while you want your burn spells to go to your opponent's face, because obviously 1 mana, 3 damage, nuts, insane, and then obviously attacking for 2 would be amazing, or anything like that, you also have to realize that when you're being aggressive, you want your cards to do as much damage as possible. So in that scenario, I would consider actually Wizard's Lightning the creature, because the Lava Runner, hopefully over the span of however many turns it lives and how many times it's able to actually hit for damage, will do more damage than what you actually spent in cards itself. Being that if that card deals 6 damage, well, Wizard's Lightning was only going to deal 3, so you essentially did 3 more damage with the Lava Runner than you did the Wizard's Lightning, because you use the Lightning in a more proactive way to keep your aggressive game plan rather than just going to the face. And that's kind of another concept and another ideology. That word's very hard, apparently. And just assuming what role you're in, what role you're going to assume in a matchup, and really just kind of stick to it. Because the more you stick to it, the easier, on one side being the control player, the more you stick to that control mentality, you can then easily shift into the aggressive, while flowing into the control from the aggressive standpoint is a lot of the time kind of hard, because most of the time you just kind of put it all out there. You do everything you can, hopefully either as fast as possible or in a way that puts your opponent in a tight spot, and if they're able to navigate from that tight spot and then put you on the back foot, you have less resources in being the control player. And as we know in Magic, or if you've played Magic for a reasonable amount of time, you know that the more resources you have generally means that you have access to more answers and a wider range of things that you could have. So you really, when you're in that situation of being the control player, you don't want to be the control player and have a significantly less amount of resources than your opponent, who is now being the aggressor, who has these obviously more things to help them push along their game plan, while you have nothing for this new role that you've now had to assume, because you can no longer be in the position to attack with your creatures or use your spells to go to the face. You now have to use those spells to go to creatures or planeswalkers or anything like that. And that's going to wrap it up for this video. It was something I felt that was really important to talk about, and a thing that was just kind of stuck on my mind for a while, because seeing a lot of players, especially a lot of new players, where they just, especially with the super aggressive decks, it's just we attack all the time, we send the spells to the face, and you don't think about it, rather than really putting it in terms of, well, when you're aggressive, you have to pick and choose how you want to be aggressive and where those resources go, because when you initially choose yourself to be aggressive, you are affording yourself less resources over the long term and trading for hopefully what is a win. And as a control player, you're asking for more resources for a longer game, so that eventually you can just use all those resources to win the game and keep yourself alive for the time being. So very important things to remember. Very easy to misidentify yourself in games of Magic like this. So having this kind of short, or rather 13-minute guide on what is something that you should be looking out for, the thing you should be thinking about when you sit down and play Magic, along with a ton of other things that should be running through your mind. But those are all discussions and ramblings for another day. Thank you all for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, or if you've learned something from it, please leave a like and consider subscribing for more rambling videos, card spotlights, deck techs, all that fun stuff. And hopefully next week we have some more good tips, more. Wow, I'm supposed to be starving. I keep talking about chips. More tips, tricks, things like that for newer Magic players, for returning or even just veterans of the game looking to get just a little bit better and looking to grind out some of those tournaments and stuff. Hopefully Monday coming up, we have some sweet new decks from the SCG tour that's actually going on right now as I'm recording it, and I really want to wrap up this video so I can go and watch that, so we're ready for Monday. But yeah, like I said before, if you liked the video or learned anything, please leave a like, consider subscribing for all the sweet news, and I will see you.